The Kingdom Swell by J.S. Gholson. Book 1 from the Tales from Beyond the Romarkian Sea. Prologue. Awake. Much has changed, master. A man in purple robes, and a hood drawn deep over his eyes, says to you, as you struggle to rise forth from the never-ending boredom that was your life before. The time had crawled by in an eternity, which was your punishment for playing with the powers of the flow. Soul-binding is in direct opposition to it, you see, but you laughed in its face and continued onwards in your journey to immortality. You did not, however, expect your bones to alter in such a grotesque and unseemly manner as they had. You did not expect to be locked in an embrace of placid nothingness, with only your thoughts to bring about further madness to yourself. Kingdoms rose and fell. Races have gone extinct in mass genocidal wars, but new ones have filled their places. We are still bounded in the north by an almost unending span of forests, the borders of which are inhabited by what's called the Urlit Empire now. The south is bounded by that great desert controlled still by the magistrates in Agbun, probably granted their long life by sacrificing their unborn to Umrlis. The west, by countless mountain ranges, and the Dead Zone, and east, by the gruesome, as always. Although one faction wishes to claim it for themselves, and so calls it after their false god, the Romarkian Sea. You will still find some familiar races who survived this long time here, but there have been new ones formed from the crypts of the Anrothian Empire. Those are the ones not known to work openly in society as of yet, but they work secretly within most of these petty kingdoms. Those are the Kevfinians, the Waitrites, the Papiliths, and the Sobkians. But, of course, you know those last. After all, you created them, my lord. The others we will learn more in the next set of dispatches. For now, rise slowly from your prison, my master, before we raise those unfortunates from their slumber. Read this first set of reports that I have compiled for you from our spies across the lands of Rupton. You will find that we will have plenty of chaos to eat away from and nourish our flocks with. End of Prologue. Chapter 1. Story 1. The Silver Chalice. There it stood, shining on the gray slab. It wasn't ridiculously shiny, only just so much so as to befit the Temple of Nimorg. It was full of a dark crimson substance, and surrounded by dwarven women wearing dark hooded robes. They were all chanting to get better attention from their god. They wished for vengeance, and the hetman was there among them. He wore long, flowing robes, which ran away past his body and his stubby legs. Those robes were likewise dyed a dark red, which made a fine contrast to the hetman's silver hair and beard, which matched the chalice in their hue. He was likewise chanting, but broke off suddenly. O Nimorg, take this gift as my true intention. Help me seek vengeance upon the magistrates of Agbun, so numerous in numbers, and so spread that they care not who they execute in their ambitions. They have done harm to my kin, and I wish to punish them in kind. Grant me, O Nimorg, that I might find a way to destroy that nation of evildoers." A voice rang out from the darkness. It was an eerie and enlightened voice, a voice guttural in its knowledge and power. "You shall have your vengeance. Seek the dwarven ruler of a land to your south, one whose kingdom has lasted many a lifespan. That ruler will allow your vengeance." The chanting had stopped, and the hetman ascended to the stone slab. He knocked over the chalice and left the room. The chanting continued. This was the hetman of Voin. His name was Belar Gholson. His kingdom was made for the Smaldietes, the short, civilized races of dwarves, halflings, and mere. Now the mere were a race characterized by their short stature, as well as having hooves instead of feet, and a forked tongue. Their bodies were likewise dwarfish, and so this made people think that they must be some distant kin. But they were so much more hairy than the dwarves that they definitely could not have been. There were two kingdoms to the south of Voin. These were stalwart and tiny realms by the names of Wolfslaw and Stokewind. There was probably no way that the Iktar cities to the west and north of Ogbun would allow Gholson to march his armies through to attack that southern state. They might wait until his armies were far into their territories, and then cut off their supplies and force a fight in hostile lands. Wolfslaw had to be the kingdom of which the gods spoke. They had a dwarven ruler, and he would be sympathetic to a kingdom of Smaldietes. That was a prosperous land which would never allow his armies to march through without an enormous sum of money. The hetman wasn't prepared to sacrifice all of his hard-earned cash so easily, even if it did mean swiftly reaching his enemies in Ogbun. Wolfslaw was naturally set at a land of rolling hills which led into the mountainous lands of Voin. Gholson needed that money to fund his armies in their advance on Ogbun. He would find another way of getting their agreement. This dwarven hetman would find a way to get military access one way or the other. Belar left the chamber and walked through his own fortress. It was built into the mountains and was always chilly there. The dwarf shivered and continued on through the long passages to his bedroom. There, he greeted his longtime friend, Loneliness. Belar had remained unmarried throughout his time on the throne. He dedicated his time to the work of running his kingdom. The mountains were a bleak place, which almost perpetually was on the brink of a food shortage. They had terraced farming, of course, but that brought in only so much grain every year. Gholson focused on delving into the unforeseen vastness beneath his realm. He pushed mining upon his people, and their short stature certainly helped in all their attempts. The hetman wanted to expand the kingdom downwards, and he especially wanted to find gold and gems down there to start a trade route with the Iktar cities, or even the Urlit Empire to his north. He knew that both were always eyeing his territory, as everyone knew what sort of wealth lay in his mountains. They had better technology than him as well. So it was only with defense in the mountains that he could threaten to keep them at bay. And Gholson could not let them get at his ochre supplies, which were most present in the mountains of Voin. The dwarf didn't know who he could trust less between those two great states. The Urlit Empire boasted a vast expanse of wildly forested land and a large population of townsmen. They were greatly comprised of elves, although with a good mix of humans and mare amongst their ranks, too. Those humans and elves interbred to create an amalgamation against nature, and they had much larger populations than his own kingdom could ever boast. The Iktar cities were a Weasley conglomeration of city-states. They were ruled overhead by a confederation council, but really the cities all did as they wanted, at least until one was threatened from the outside realms. Then, all together, they would come in defense of their own territories. With enough looks, you could convince one of the Iktar cities to fight on your side. They were formidable in battle, as they had weapons which could shoot tiny iron pellets so far and fast that they could almost fully penetrate plate armor. But they kept their prices steep, and with good reason. It was lucky for most of the other kingdoms that they were in almost eternal squabbles with each other, and no one really wanted to attack the hornet's nest. So, Gholson could count the Iktar cities out of attacking his own kingdom while the army was on the march because of those squabbles. He still had to worry about the Urlit Empire on his northern expanse, though. The dwarf needed to attack Arbun and get the god-sanctioned vengeance that he so much wanted. He had to find a way to accomplish this, and he knew just the way. End of Chapter 1, Story 1. Beginning of Chapter 2, Story 2. The Iron Plate. "Can you hand me that plate, please?" The plate was intricate in its design. It had some sort of floral pattern laid out on its iron surface, with little rubies inlaid in the iron itself. There was a large chicken piled on top of all that. Though all around the banquet was going on, it was silent still. A man's voice rang out in the stillness. He was a dwarf, and quite looked the part. He had a long, braided brown beard, and short, cropped hair. His nose was long and wide, and his eyes were brown, to go along with the rest of his body. He wore fine clothes. They were made of the best wool and cloth of gold, with a rotating tree and stone emblem on his breast. His courtiers sat all around at benches and tables made of the smoothest oak wood. Their tables were richly decorated with white satin tablecloths and piles of food. There were plates of half-meat, doves and pies, a whole roast pig, and plenty of glasses of wine and vodka and beer. We mustn't forget, of course, the mighty breads, the cabbage, potatoes, and cauliflower spread around on plates either, and so much more. There were noblemen and ladies sitting around those tables, wearing all sorts of rich brocade to signify who they were and which castles they came from. It was a feast to suit the Grand Duke of Wolslaw, Ayrton Cotid, and he sat proudly at its head. He chose the title of Duke as his humbleness would not claim kingship like his father had, even though he was still the ruler of all of Wolslaw. Plus, this title spoke to the Iktar cities, Voin and Ogbun, that he might be persuaded into vassalship. The plate of chicken was passed to the fine dwarf, and his carver stood there and cut lumps of meat out for the Grand Duke. The hall remained silent as the ch-ch-ch-ch of the knife worked its magic. The hall was in the main stone castle of Wolslaw. There were others scattered around his tiny kingdom, but none so rich as this. Banners of the stone and tree emblem were spread around the hall in its gold and green surroundings to signify the wealth of Duke Ertin. The clumps of meat were separated onto another plate for the dwarf to enjoy at his leisure. Ertin sipped wine and stood up. He started to speak. A low, gruff voice resounded out of him. "Thank you all for joining me on this most momentous occasion. 300 years since Wolfslaw was founded. A toast to the notable families who helped make the kingdom possible, for before them, there was nothing in these mountains." The lords and ladies of present all raised their glasses in unison. There were several ambassadors there as well. A sturdy-looking dwarf with graying black hair, a long braided beard, and a crooked nose sat several tables down from the Duke. This was the ambassador from Voin, that almost solely Smollett's kingdom up north. There were the different representatives of Merritt, Stoquin, and Kyndeeran, as well at the same table. Those were the independent kingdoms that lay close on Wolfslaw's borders. Much like that kingdom, those others had not yet declared a side in the war to come between Voin and Ogbun. Intelligence reports had brought in that there was going to be one, of course, but neither side had openly declared as of yet, and everyone knew that it was coming. There were always the questions of how they would get through the border states to attack one another. Ertin had heard rumors that those border states might be propelled into joining a league of armed neutrality for their own sakes. There was also talk of Romarkia attacking Ogbun for their own war, to reclaim some outlying territory, while Ogbun was distracted in the north with Voin. Technically, Wolfslaw was still neutral in the war that was yet to come. There had been no declarations from the Grand Duke as it stood, though it was clear to see that he was a dwarf, and Wolfslaw was almost solely made up of dwarves, with a few prominent exceptions here and there. So, he would likely side with the kingdom, who looked out for dwarves also, and that kingdom, of course, was Voin. Then again, being a dwarf meant that he hated halflings. Those creatures being shorter than himself just made no sense whatsoever, and they were a race which should never have been created, and needed to be destroyed for things to make sense again. Ertin had also heard that the magistrates of Ogbun hated halflings nearly as much as he did, while Voin had a totally neutral stance on the hobbits, and sometimes even considered them brothers or kin, because they were also a short race, and part of what they liked to call Smollets. Thinking of them as brothers, because they're short, is like thinking of goblins, hobgoblins, and the like, as brothers, also simply because they're all short. It didn't make any sense. It was disgusting. Luckily, Ertin was able to expel the halflings, and the elves too. No one liked nor trusted those tall critters anyways. They were another abomination, too tall for their own good. There needed to be a reckoning. He knew that the elves had high places of power in the various kingdoms of Rupton, but Ertin didn't care. Every time the Grand Duke expelled those people, they found some way back into his kingdom as money dealers. They broke down Lux into its constituent parts, Capiets and Urlits, and they had been able to establish this currency throughout Rupton. Ertin never knew where these elves got all their money to do this, but he highly suspected it was the work of the blasted trading kingdom of Romarkia, and the halflings who did the mining for them. The elves always knew how to foment rebellion in any kingdom that they wanted, and they made up most of the rebellious. They were so often represented by those hated groups as if to anger the kingdoms which they were visiting on purpose, as if they knew how to get themselves expelled or killed. There were no elves or hobbits in Urtin's halls except for the delicious half-meat from halflings on the tables. The toasts continued around the room. The next person to make one was Ayrton's wife. She was a comely dwarf woman with dark brown hair and eyes to go along with it. It was a hard task, but she managed to keep her beard at bay by shaving every day in the wee hours of the night, so her husband wouldn't notice. Her name was Rebecca Cotid, and she was the love of his life. To the frugal bookkeeping of Grand Duke Ayrton, for without him we would have fallen into oblivion long ago. The old ruler of Wolfslaw, King Loken, had enjoyed wasting the meager sums of money that his kingdom brought in on food and games. He had been a beloved king because of this. There were always boar fights, vast feasts, and free bread for the citizens of his kingdom while he was alive. Loken had driven the kingdom onto the brink of default from his debts and loans which were taken by those greedy elves. He was a king who loved to be liked, and he spared no expense for it. Wherever he traveled, there would be an elven moneylender nearby. They always hoped he would take out a loan at the exorbitant interests that they charged. There started to be great discontent in the kingdom, and talk of vassals, both mayors and barons, changing their allegiances to any number of the kingdoms which were closest to them. Kyndeeran was almost at the point of invading and annexing their country because they were almost certain that the subjects would put up absolutely no fight. That was the time when King Loken had eaten one too many chickens, drank one too many vodka shots. He had had a heart attack, and quickly succumbed because of his bloated body and bad health. At least that's what his son told the kingdom. Luckily, the boy's mother had been dead for years at that point, and he was the only heir. So there was some talk of foul play, and the new ruler quickly put an end to it. That talk was all dispelled as Ayrton took the throne. He quickly made sure to relinquish the elves, who had been so nice to his father, of all their gold. The Grand Duke did this after changing his title to further mark a difference between him and his father. Once Ayrton had gathered all the gold up, he quickly rounded all the elves up as well. He gave them a simple choice: leave on their own, or be forcefully expelled. The elves were a proud lot from all their money-lending days, and living the rich life. They chose to be expelled rather than leave of their own volition. This was supposed to be some sort of act of defiance against his tyranny, but all it did was allow the Grand Duke to claim their lands and property as the crown's. He then distributed these lands equally amongst his various vassals. Those vassals were more than happy to receive extra land at no expense of their own, of course. This made the fact that their ruler was now raising taxes and cutting his own spending a little easier to stomach. Ayrton would rebuild the realm that his father had destroyed so haphazardly. The first things which he did after expelling the elves was to build a series of mills in his own holdings and expand their granaries as well, as enlarge cisterns for the castles in his kingdom. Grand Duke Ayrton didn't expect a siege, but you can never be too safe. He also required a larger levy from his barons in both men and grain. No longer were there going to be feasts and debauchery untold. The days of borrowing money past bankruptcy were over. The days of borrowing money, period, were over. And getting rid of the elves was the first step in what would be a long and hard economic recovery for his kingdom. Now you know that Wolslawians were a proud and independent people made up of largely dwarvish ruling nobility, with humans as the common folk. They were characterized by honest living and backbreaking labors in their fields, plus a good, God-fearing hatred for all things outside of their realm. They did this happily in service to Starved-tin, the god who fought off hunger every day for them. Of course, the dwarves primarily stuck to Groganus, though not nearly as fearsome as the people of Voin did. The hetman Gholson had now forgotten his oaths to the god of dwarves, however, and it was looking as if Groganus would turn his back on them also. Back in the hall, the other vassals went toasting after Ayrton's wife. The next one was Baron Truktuin. He was a large human, almost double the size of Ayrton, with graying hairs eating away at his blatant red hair. The Baron was the most prominent representative of his race in Wolslaw. He was clean-shaven, so he wouldn't be competing with any of the dwarves in the room. He knew he couldn't outmatch any of their beards anyways. He owned the next largest estate to the Grand Duke. It was a low, flowing valley nestled between hills where the majority of his peasants grazed livestock, and a right proper dairy trade were coming out of his domains. Some of the other dwarves bemoaned this fact, but he had won it through good, honest service to their lord, although some would plot to take away his lands. "Hear, hear! To our soldiers, the men who keep bandits at bay!" His toast rang out. It wasn't really the soldiers that he was cheering to, so much as the townsguard who deserved that toast, and who everyone was thinking of at that moment. The real soldiers hadn't seen action for a very long time. The Grand Duke had used Baron Truktuin's leather manufacturing for the mass production of leather armor, both jerkins and pants plus gloves for the guard. Of course, by that time, Ayrton had been able to set up tanneries on the Baron's land, with his permission, of course, as the Duke paid him in looks from the expelled elves. After the manufacturing got up and running, this armor was then distributed to all of the town's guards through the Grand Duke's realms. Every vassal was given a starting sum of the equipment at no charge. If they wanted more, then they would have to buy it from Baron Truktuin himself, where Ayrton would gain a sizable kickback in the form of taxes on the traded and manufactured goods. All of the vassals in the land saw the immediate effectiveness of the new armor. Where once their militiamen had used simple padded jackets and woolen leggings, now they had upgraded to something that could be called real armor. They wore the padded stuff underneath this, of course, for multiple layering of protection still, and the combination, it worked like a charm. There were many times that a group of guardsmen walked about on their nightly patrols, and they chanced upon some dastardly deed about to happen. The guards then whipped out their cudgels, while their assailants had his sharp knife to attack them with. The patrol was made up of 4 men, normally humans but sometimes mixed in with dwarves as well. They would circle around the criminal, all daring him to slash at them, whilst they brandished those wooden weapons in an ever more threatening manner. The Cretan would respond to their dares by cutting at the nearest one. Before this armor, that man would have been cut down and out of the fight probably. But now, he could sustain at least one more blow from the knife, and he used this precious instant to crack down upon the evildoer's head. When the Baron Truktuin toasted the soldiers, he was really toasting himself, and the Grand Duke alongside those guards. It was a brass and brazen thing for him to do, but he did it all the same. That was the goodly Baron. He knew that his domain was large and his levy the most out of the others, but he always had a good sense of humor about it. He didn't begrudge others making a mockery that his wealth all came from a bunch of stinking cow farts either. Instead, he just laughed and laughed, as the other barons bought not only their dairy goods from him, but also his leather goods, and his pockets were filled with ever more looks. The toasts continued as such, with every vassal there celebrating their duke in their own manners. Those included, but were not limited to, good crops for the year, protection from the elements, protections from the other kingdoms, safety from fires, safety from hobgoblins and goblins, and a general well-being amongst their populations. The main source of entertainment arrived as well. A man from the south came and set up his raucous amusement for all to see. It was a powdery substance, like stone ground to a fine dust. He set it in the middle of the stone hall in a heaping pile, and spread a line backwards towards the entrance, making sure to avoid any contact with wood or getting too close to the guards. Food was moving about as the etiquette demanded that the lords and ladies eating, and then their servants taking pieces as well. It was a rather peaceful affair, as the stranger started to lay down his substance. The stranger had a long, flowing beard, and a rather dark and squat face. His skin was waned from all the years spent in a very dry environment. This was not a person from Wolslaw. He was most likely a dissident Ogbunian, those southern people known for their conservationist and cautious nature, who specialized in their so-called Grand Army of mostly infantry who wielded poleaxes in a fearsome display of strength. That's what those Ogbunians were all about. Strength, no matter how they could get it. He started saying something with a clear and ringing voice. Excuse me! Can I have your attention, my lords and ladies? This seemed to do the trick and quieted down the hall. Suddenly, everyone stopped drinking and eating. Although it wasn't noisy at all, the people gathered together in their deepening silence. My gracious Grand Duke, would you like me to explain what I will do beforehand or afterwards? After! Ayrton laughed in anticipation of whatever this trickster had in store for them. Now the Duke had no idea what would happen. He had left the entertainment up to his subordinates to deal with. He was utterly excited at whatever was planned for the evening. Already the musicians who were chosen were of an excellent sort. This southern stranger beamed in anticipation at what he was about to release upon his audience. They had probably never experienced what he had in store for them. It was a purely secretive experiment that this man had brought from Ogbun, known only to those in the Iktar cities and maybe some others. He went to the end of this little line of grey powder. The stranger then withdrew a glowing ember from only the gods knew where. It was a small line, but he fixed the ember to it expectantly. Suddenly, a hiss rang out. That hiss continued as a flash grasped the powder. The smoke jumped out and continued onwards towards the large pile in the middle, hissing all the while and carrying on it an acrid, bitter smell. Then it hit. A great explosion lifted all those people out of their seats. A pillar of fire shot up almost to the roof. Everyone shouted. Screams extended from the women and the men who had to shelter them. The guards were immediately around this stranger, and the Grand Duke was up in his seat, shouting as well. It was exceptional, utter chaos in the Grand Hall of Wolslaw. The guards had sharp spears strained on the stranger to prevent him from escaping. He didn't do anything except to meekly bow his head and seemingly await his execution. He was a humble man, after all was said and done. Ayrton walked towards him swiftly and said, "Now calm down, everyone. Wow, that was quite amazing, although frightening. Now's your chance to explain yourself. Though I should have had you explain it beforehand." The Duke, taking charge like this, certainly did calm down his vassals and those in the hall. The women realized that things were under control, and the men relinquished their hands from the scabbards of their swords. Still, they all looked a bit concerned at this entire situation. What had been a rather polite and efficacious evening of eating had turned into a startling show of whatever magic this could be. The stranger bowed deeply, making sure to avoid moving too quickly, and said, "This is no magic that you are seeing, no wicked conjuring from Urlit, nor a divine blessing from Akasi. This is a new substance called black powder. In Arbun and some of the Ektar cities, they use this in their weapons to propel tiny iron pellets at incredible speeds into their enemies. They sometimes pile it up and use it to demolish buildings as well. This powder is quite powerful indeed, and I have the knowledge capable of creating more of this for Warsaw. But at a price." At this last statement, the humans started to resemble an elf in that elves always wanted to milk money out of stones. Plus, it was neither the time nor the place to be asking for looks. Ayrton stood a little silent at first. Then he said, "That is fantastic. You and I will talk more, but first, a round of applause for our kindly stranger." The Grand Duke started it off at a quick, hand-slapping pace. Soon the whole audience joined in. There were some who even cheered on this old man for his spectacle. Then that stranger was taken out of the room by several guards, and the feasting continued. The jovial nature of all gathered together returned immediately, and more vassals started to toast their wonderful leader. Now the feasting wound down to an interminable halt, when Ayrton finally got up after several hours and said, "My dear barons and baronesses, my lovely ambassadors and servants, thank you for making this a lovely night to remember. We shan't see it again for some time to come. Return to your domains and realms, knowing that all is well within the kingdom. We're all growing prosperous once more. One final cheer for Warsaw." The people gathered together in the center, and all gave a great hoopla for their mother country. All had lived, worked, and fought, and struggled for its independence. The size of Warsaw had partially protected it. No other kingdom had noticed this little one on their borders until now. There was soon going to be a war going on, though. And as of yet, it didn't involve Warsaw directly. There were powers looking to add the kingdom to their pieces on the chessboard of international diplomacy. It was a prosperous little self-sufficient kingdom, and would count highly as a prize to the others. Ayrton saw off the last of his guests into the torchlit night, and returned to find that stranger. The man from the south held his wan face downwards, towards the rugged stone floor, as the Grand Duke entered. The stranger had been moved to a much smaller room, which still held a large oaken table in it, but with less food piled on top. The quality of food also was diminished, as it came out to cracklings and other pork substances. And that was about it, along with only one glass of ale. 4 guards stood in the room to watch the stranger eat, and make sure that he didn't escape. "Ah, that's where they took you. I trust the food and drinking are to your liking." "Yes, indeed. The pig is the most honest of all the animals, so it is my preferred animal to eat. You can almost taste its simplicity. Roll around in the muck, eat slops all your life, and you have a wonderful meal once it's slaughtered. I particularly love its giblets and all of the goodies which were so dear to it in life. Now, they are dear to me in death. Ayrton didn't really know how to respond to that, except by saying, Wolslaw does have the best pigs on this side of the Gholson. I'm glad to see that you've made yourself at home here. I would love to see that Wolslaw become your new home for a good while longer as well. We have not become acquainted as of yet, though you doubtless know my name already. Here the Duke bowed low to his guest. Here the Grand Duke bowed low to his guest. I am Grand Duke Ayrton Coated, ruler of all Wolslaw, and your host tonight. The stranger stood up and lowered his whole body in this instant to accept the introduction. He also bowed down and said, I am honored to formally make your acquaintance, Grand Duke. I am Hannes Horius of Ogbun. I fled that state as they were executing anyone with Romachian sympathies. I believe in the principles that they espouse over there, but they had closed their borders before I could make it across to safety. That's an unfortunate thing for you, but an astoundingly happy one for me, I see. Tell me, out of the border states, why did you choose to bring your secret knowledge to my court? In Ogbun, there was talk of a rich kingdom with an enlightened dwarven ruler. I simply walked to that kingdom. Sure, it was a hard journey, but I thought it'd be worth it in the end. You were correct in coming here. I will put you up in the best rooms of the castle. How much for your services? How much for your knowledge? Hannes Hurius thought on this for a split second, because he had already made up his mind beforehand. I want 500 looks, both as payment for the information and for the setup of the running of the manufactories. The Duke was thrown aback. This was an incredible amount. It was almost certainly bankrupt the realm and open it up for invasion. Although there were plenty of hills and mountains which led to a direct path to Voin, who might be friendly in times of trouble. The Grand Duke had several means of defending his realm, but he would need help. He would need allies. Would he stoop so low to ask the elves for their money in assurance that they would have a place in society, and he could keep the kingdom afloat? These thoughts all ran through the dwarf's head. Finally, he answered, And what will you do with all that gold? Like I said, I'll start making black powder, and, of course, weapons to go along with it. Some of the Ictar cities have long been using it, but we will outproduce them in both quantity and quality, and Ogbun has recently started, but they look down on it, as a coward's tool to use. My Duke, your armies will be able to march over the other border states here, and once they are under your sway, then you will be able to rival even the full might of the Ictar cities and Ogbun combined. This did sound amazing to Ayrton, but could this stranger be trusted? I'll have to allow Voin to move troops through in order to attack Ogbun, and then, without allying necessarily, they will be obliged to protect Warslaw if someone tries to take advantage of our weakened state. It could be the most perfect compromise to conduct, and after that they are weakened through war. I can use these new weapons to push those hobbit lovers out of precious Warslaw and protect our lands. Ayrton thought all this was a soundproof plan. He then replied to the stranger, "Yes, you shall have your gold, Honeus Hurries." End of Story 2, Chapter 2. Beginning of Story 3, Chapter 3. The Grey Ball. The screaming is what he couldn't take. There was always yelling. At least it wasn't only targeted at him, but to their whole unit. That made it slightly better. Still, he didn't even want to be there. His father had made the decision to enlist him into the Orlovian organ gunners. It was either that or sell him to an undertaker as an apprentice. The two options presented for Faris a rather simple but serious dilemma. The swarthy human could make death or take death. He had a relatively weak stomach and didn't want to be one of the ones who had to scour the mass battlefields in order to recover the bodies before the Morziks got there. They were ugly creatures, those Morziks, resembling a goblin, except with incredibly pale skin and a too-wide mouth who eat the dead. Faris didn't really want to deal with those things. He shuddered. "About face! March!" The drill sergeant bellowed at the top of his lungs. It was intended simply to annoy these cadets. This was a tiny human. He was almost the size of a tall dwarf. If the cadets really wanted to piss him off, all they had to do was call him a dwarf, and it would ignite in him the secret worries that his human mother had slept with one of those men in that short race. She had raised him singly, and so there might have actually been dwarven blood pumping through his veins. Although the sergeant didn't have any facial hair, so maybe he wasn't a disgusting half-dwarf after all. "Left face! Erect stands! Aim! Fire all barrels!" Faris dropped out his organ gun parallel to him and pulled the powder horn off his belt to fill each barrel. He then dropped in the tiny musket balls and rammed it all down. Faris lifted the hard palm wood pole out in front of the firearm. He hoisted 3 small-barreled organ guns succinctly onto the stand and aimed down range. The human looked at his target, and what he saw there he shouldn't have believed. But times were tough, and they called for this sort of thing. Straight down the firing range were a bunch of halfling children. They had been caught spreading Romarkian propaganda. Whoever had put them up to the task probably thought that the fact of them being children would have saved their lives. The magistrates of Ogbun did not care, for justice is a blind and harsh mistress. Spreading that sort of filth is always punishable by death, no matter who they are. The Romarkians would be getting a taste of true equality, like they so often wanted. The squad cocked back all of their barrels in unison, and loaded powder underneath the hammers. The next thing was to pull on the lever that releases those hammers. A great click went out through the silent morning air. This is exactly what happened when Faris was the first to do it. Everyone else seemed to follow his example. Then it all ensued. There was a great belch of fire and smoke, and musket balls which shot out from these beasts of war. The noise was so much that it could no doubt be heard several lanes down by those sleeping on ostrich feather beds in their slums of houses. At least this noise blocked out that of the screaming children. It was like a quick lightning strike to stop your annoying dog from barking. The smoke was such that it was as if a great fire had been placed to smoke out a beehive, except everyone there were the bees. They couldn't see a thing whatsoever. It took several minutes until the heavy black smoke dissipated into the beautiful sunrise. And what a beautiful sunrise it was. It was at that point, at those same undertakers, who Forrest had refused to join, crawled out with their apprentices and their wheelbarrows to load up the small bodies. They had to get them out of their fast, as halfling meat sold very well on the markets in those days. You know, it was tough to find a fresh kill ever since those magistrates had outlawed killing halflings for anything but a capital crime. These undertakers were about to rack up some serious dough in selling this meat. It might be enough for a tiny vacation for them and their families. Yes, those undertakers were lucky men on that day. About face! At ease! Back to barracks! Forrest trotted off with the rest of his execution squad. It was definitely the worst place for him to be, but it offered his family money and him a place to sleep. If the human was lucky, then he would get some rations for the day. Otherwise, he would have to depend on food brought by his family, or simply starve, with no way to get food for himself on the base. Forrest was hated. Well, all the organ gunners were. They were the lowest of the low in the Grand Army, because they didn't have the guts, skill, or ability to face their foe in close quarters. The rest of the army was made up of lancers, and the infantry, of course, armed with poleaxes. Now that's where the real glory was. Forrest dreamed of becoming a foot soldier to gain a real iron helmet, and a chance to die close up in combat. Urlit and the magistrates would be pleased with that. Really, Urlit was pleased in what he was doing currently. Executions were like a tribute to him, and the more life the executed could have had, the more pleasure it gave to the god. That's exactly why a cult had sprung up to execute the unborn children in the womb. The magistrates of Ogbun did not approve of this, since it reduced their fighting forces in the long run, and so the cult had to operate in the shadows. The women who sacrificed their children gained a future full of hope and opportunities. It was very difficult to ever fully eradicate this cult. Currently, there was a sort of truce between them and the magistrates, because some of those same men gained wealth and influence by secretly working with Urlit. After all, the god wasn't openly worshipped in Ogbun, or anywhere else for that matter. Anyway, Forrest trotted through this enclosed courtyard. There were sandstone walls about 2 stories high surrounding the army base, and the grass lay in sparse patches through the muddy tracks which he traversed. It had rained the day before, and they were lucky in that. The millet farmers had needed water as some of their wells were starting to run dry. It was the hottest time of the year out here in the desert. The human returned to his barrack, trying not to sweat profusely. Forrest placed the organ gun into its locker along with the powder horn in his pocket of balls. He was lucky in the fact that he didn't have to clean the barrels. He had only fired 6 barrels so far this week, and it wouldn't need the mandatory cleaning until after the 9th firing. He only had 2 changes of uniform besides his civilian clothes that his lieutenant had given them. It was one for winter and one for summer, and he dreaded the day when he would have to switch to the winter clothes. It was getting on to that time from the smell of his current clothes as he looked down onto his small cot. Both uniforms were made of undyed wool, but one was slightly thicker. The pockets were large on the jackets, designed to fit anything that needed carrying. Wooden buttons ran the left length of the chest, and a low collar for the summer and a high collar for the winter. There were full-length jackets that reached halfway down his thighs. Forrest received 2 pairs of hose, which were dyed one length black and one red for each leg. This signified that he was in the execution squad, and to be looked down upon. His uniform came with a straw tricorn as well. The army wanted to spend as little as possible on these layabouts. He tore off his clothes and threw them onto the cot in a pell-mell fashion, but in a way that he could find everything still. Forrest wanted to switch to his personal clothes, but there was also an extremely convincing, lazy feeling in his mind. It was probably the heat that caressed him into a tiredness that was almost too much for Forrest. Luckily, his neighbor woke him out of this stupor with a whisper. "Hey, Forrest! Psst! What you want, Lucas? That was bloody awful. I didn't think we'd ever execute children." "It is what it is, Lucas. Not our place to question. And I mean, did you hear what they were charged with?" "Yeah, spreading Romarkian propaganda. But should we be executing children for that?" Forrest almost turned his head and spat. "Yeah, anyone should be executed for that. And just think of all that sweet half-mate. I got hungry at the sight of those undertakers taking them away to be butchered. Sometimes I think that I chose the wrong profession." Lucas looked appalled. "You would eat that stuff?" "Most definitely." "Why, you wouldn't?" "Most definitely not." Forrest wanted to make fun of this guy in front of the others, but there were no people there besides the 2. Instead, he cupped his mouth as if to shout and said, "We got a poor boy here. Ain't never tried half-meat, and don't wanna. Ha! I can't believe you, Lucas. Half-meat is better than beefsteaks. I only had it once in my life, but at least it was once." Lucas's faint face turned red as a beet. "Shut up, Forrest. I could have had it whenever I wanted. I just thought it was inhumane to eat something that could talk." "Oh, well, excuse me. I didn't realize you had so much choice in what you ate. Mr. Rich Boy over here. Just as 'cause I choose what food I eat doesn't make me rich. I'm still in the execution squad as is. A rich boy as I ever seen one. I've eaten anything that's given to me, and I'm happy for it. Ain't got no time to be picky. What was your father? Some sort of magistrate or something?" Lucas burst out in anger. "Yes, he is. So what?" Forrest couldn't believe his ears. There must have been something real bad that his father did. If his son was here. Only those who could hardly survive on their own found themselves in the execution squad. That's precisely why Forrest was there. His father, Kyndeeran, had been a grave digger, and there's no money in that. The best he could do for his son was to get him into the Grand Army, even if it meant that Forrest would be spat on by everyone. And to Forrest, it was a good sight better than being an undertaker still. A magistrate's son, on the other hand, would have all the doors open for him. Lucas would have been in the Lancers. So, why wasn't he there? Forrest didn't have a chance to ask. Their 3 other squad mates walked in. Horace, Munis, and Duxus. These were all scrawny men, with little beady eyes, black-haired and angry-looking. They huffed as they walked in, still sweating in their summer uniforms and lugging their 3-barreled organ guns around.
Oi, I can't believe it out there.
Moonis started in a gruff manner. His voice did not match his body, as it was deeper than all those in the barracks. He always spoke for the 3 of them as who had walked in.
It's killer hot, and these idiots want to start acting up. You know, it's been quite some time since I killed chillins, but never for something so stupid. You'd think their parents would have more sense than to put them up to this. They knew they'd get killed. I mean, it's just incredible that halflings should be miscreants this time. I thought they would have learned by now.
It is what it is, sighed Forrest, ever the realist. What else are we to do? Let them spread this crap. That's really how we ruin Ogburn from within. Just gotta carry out the law until these mites realize that the law's law and it's gotta be followed. Lucas broke in quickly. We could do something at least. We could change these laws. Make it so that children aren't being killed. Forrest laughed at that. Children aren't being killed, Lucas. They're executed. And with good reason. If the law gets slackened just one bit, then all hell will break loose. You're one to talk. Fellas, this boy's father is a magistrate. Can you imagine? Forrest rolled back onto his bed laughing. Meanwhile, the other 3 who had just walked in held their mouths agape. They looked like some sort of apes who had just walked in from the western jungles. They looked something fierce ugly in their straw hats dripping with sweat.
Serious, bruv? I can't hardly believe it.
Moonis shouted. He was excited to find someone so above his station down here. Lucas didn't enjoy any of this. He had a bad habit of turning red at embarrassment, and this happened now. He crumpled into his cot to avoid the gazing eyes of his squad mates. Before he could answer, however, the sergeant burst in. He was a burly man, human, with epaulets to signify rank, and the top button on his plain woolen jacket was silver. These were the only markers to identify him. Otherwise, he wore a crew cut and a brazenly clean-shaven face below his 2 dark eyes.
Get into uniform, and grab your guns fast!
We're mobilizing the whole home guard! He ran on to the next barracks after shouting at them. Forrest was glad that he hadn't switched fully into civilian clothes yet, but he wished he had eaten. He quickly jumped out into his sweat-drenched outfit, ignoring the smell and disgusting feeling of it. Even this would be better than his winter uniform in the heat for the long run. The human ran over to his locker and threw the horn and balls into his pockets. Left for horn, right for balls. This way, it'd be easier for him to remember. He put on his straw hat and left with the rest of the squad. There were other execution squads lining up outside on either sides of his barracks. The small, squat wooden building seemed to contain an endless supply of men. Further down, he could see the infantry shuffle out of their buildings. Those men were a sight better than himself. They all wore butternut-colored uniforms made up of rough leather jerkins and padded pants, plus their mighty iron kettle helmets. Everyone was lining up in front of their barracks in an orderly fashion. The executioners were last in a long line that spanned as far as the eye could see to the front gates. They were hidden furthest away for fear that some magistrate might see them and be rather disgusted. Theirs was a dirty job, after all. Their sergeant looked them over in disgust. He had gained some rank and prestige and a nicer living wage, but he still hated what he did. Piteous, the sergeant, was thrust into his position with the executioners, much like Forrest had been. It was either that or starve at the beginning. Putius had been at this for nigh on 10 years, while it was Faris's second month only. Faris had seen a good deal and done a good many executions, but he hadn't really seen anything that bad yet.
"Form ranks! Right face! Quick march!"
Faris and his squad joined up with the other execution squads. There were about 10 in total, making the grand number reach 50 for all of the executioners in the grand army. They walked at a brisk canter onwards towards the entrance. The barracks became noticeably better as they went further toward the entrance. No longer were they squat and wooden without any windows and no chimney. These others had multiple windows, all opened up to let any breeze walk right on through. Plus, they didn't have any noticeable smells coming from within, unlike their own barracks. From what Faris could see, most had wooden platforms inside, unlike their packed dirt flooring. These barracks sometimes even had full wooden beds with plush mattresses. It would be a dream to sleep on one of those compared to their rickety wooden cots and straw mattresses. Faris was nearing the entrance to their little army base. It was teeming with men, though not as much as the entire Grand Army had, for they were out getting prepared for the fight against Voin, that disgusting kingdom full of dwarves to the north. And they were so boisterous as to enlist lizardmen from the Iktar cities. Plus, they were trying to side Wolslaw against them. At least the southerly kingdom of Ogbun might convince the tinier border states to fight for them, besides Wolslaw, those kingdoms who had no real alliances but to themselves. Romarkia was that blasted trading kingdom on the shores of what they liked to call the Romarkian Sea, on account of their mythical prophet who had crossed ages ago. They were so stupid as to think there was something on the other side. Others just liked to call that body of water the Gholson. Romarkians were the ones who tried to corrupt Ogbun's system of life with their nonsense talk of freely trading with whoever they wanted. The halflings and elves had probably gotten their claws into that kingdom long ago. Faris hadn't been this far towards the real city in some time. Normally, he just stayed back where all the executions took place. He did as he was told, and didn't want much anything more than his food and his clothes laundered every couple of weeks. The city, Orlov, sprang up in front of the human. It was a vast sprawl of wattle and dub towers, mixed in with pure wooden towers, and the occasional stone one as well, for as far as his eyes could see. One fire in the city would bring it all crashing down. But as it stood, people went about in their daily lives just normally, with plenty of wells scattered around, and a dedicated spellbinder to protect against those fires. People who were procuring goods for the magistrates and making orders that needed fulfillment as soon as possible. People who had to find their grocers and butchers to buy food for the day. Laborers who went about constructing these towers on endless wooden scaffolds. And servants. So many blasted servants were scurrying around. There used to be slaves who ran around doing the bidding of their masters instead of all these servants. But some of the magistrates of Orlov realized something long ago. If they kept slaves, then they'd have to clothe them, feed them, and make sure they're healthy. Servants were much easier. Servants make a pittance, and still they have to do everything for themselves. Clothes, food, health, these are all up to the servants and not their masters. It was a much better way to go for the majority of magistrates and their allies in Orlov. There were other kingdoms that used slaves, of course. There were other cities in Ogbun that practiced slavery. Other magistrates, even in Orlov, who practiced it. Those were much less progressive ones than the servant lovers there. They hadn't realized yet that money was a much better controller of men than mere force. "Form up! Look ready! Here comes a magistrate!"
"Boy, look at him, Farce,"
Munis whispered this excitedly. Farce looked all right. The first thing that he noticed was that it wasn't an M, but a R. Her hair was braided in a bun, almost fully hidden by the hood she wore. It was an intricate mess to look on. Layers of iron scales lay on top of each other to create an armored coat for this woman. She piled a bright red cloak on top of that ensemble. Her riding boots reached up to her knees, and the rest Forrest could not see. She rode on a dark black stallion. The horse's nose enlarged, and he brayed as the two rode closer to their execution squad. His ears acted wildly, and he almost reared if it wasn't for her expert handling of him. Her voice was deep for a woman. She looked at the executioner and said,
"And pray tell me, what are these foul-smelling troops, Sergeant?"
The little sergeant sweat even more profusely at her question.
"We are the executioners of the Grand Army, madam. If a criminal needs to be put down, then we're the ones to do it." "I know what executioners are. No need to further explain them. What sort did you last put down?" "Propagandists, Your Honor. A bunch of filthy halfling children." "Good that we got them, and did what was necessary. Better to catch them while they're young, rather than let them turn out as their parents do and wind up killing the innocent. Tell me, do you know why you were called out here?" "No, ma'am. I just do as told." "Good. Well, I'll inform you. There's been reports of Romarkian radicals agitating rebellion. Every man is needed for sweeping the city." As she was talking from her high horse, a reverberation was felt throughout the army. An explosion racketed throughout the ranks, and there was a wide plume of flames that shot upwards in a bright blue light to the sky. It went right up one of the stone towers, blasting aside the rocks which made it up. That tower knocked over a wooden one, and they both fell nearly towards the military base. The horse finally reared, and the magistrate fell back onto her head in the chaos. There was but one shout to be heard among the rest at that time. "Blasted Romarkians!" End of Chapter 3, Story 3. Beginning of Chapter 4, Story 4. The Earl of Urlit. This was the one man with an action-packed plan. He recently inherited the earlship from his father, the late Earl Vidithan. He was wary and had wavy brown hair and a smoothly shaven face, petulant eyebrows, and sadistic eyes. This was the man who had inherited a tiny kingdom in the far north and made it into an empire. This was the ruler of the Urlit Empire. This was Earl Gholson. He strode confidently into his throne room to hear out petitioners for the day. This was a large room with a high cavernous ceiling and vaulted arches spanning it. There were two banister staircases which, presumably, led up to the bedrooms of the castle. A sprightly wooden throne stood back towards a stone wall with a brightly colored purple rug underneath. There were exorbitantly hued red banners strewn on the walls in the heraldry of the Earl. This was made up of a symbol of a squirrel in the middle with silver diamonds overlaid on it. Flames were sighted in torches implanted all over the walls, and 4 or 5 iron chandeliers held many candles up to light up the place. There were some windows towards the top of the walls to let in natural light, but for the most part those windows were tiny in case of a siege.
But there had not been a siege at the castle of Urlit in quite some time, not at least since Gholson had started to reign in and create his empire. Urlites were a hardy people. Even though the empire now stretched across the north, they were all bound together by survival against the various and sundry monsters who lived in the far-reaching woods. They didn't care what race you were, so far as you could hold your own in the wilds. And so, the Urlit Empire was made up of pretty much all the races in those lands. The cities were changing that way of life, and changing it fast, because of the ever-increasing use of ochre among the populace. The lands surrounding the castle were rich in their forests and deep crevices in the earth, for mining all sorts of things. They had several ochre mines there as well, which employed most of the inhabitants of Gholson's direct domain. Most of those industrious inhabitants, such as the humans and dwarves, loved working there on account of the pay. There was a tiny population of mere, halflings, elves, and even Sobkians, dog-like people who were hairy and shed, and were utterly foul in his lands. Sobkians swore as the dirtiest gladiators were wont to do, and they dogged after women. Not just Sobkian women either. They went after all sorts. Those races were mostly drunks or high off of ochre, an addicting substance which shot dopamine through you and allowed one to gain a better hold of their magic. Some spellbinders argued that you could only use magic with the potions of ochre. It was also the only surefire way to enchant things with, otherwise it would always be a gamble. The downsides to this were wholly apparent. Over time, ochre use would cause the eyes to grow blurry until one couldn't see at all, and two of your limbs would stop working entirely. The worst part about that was not knowing which limbs would stop, because it was so utterly random. Sometimes no usage in an arm and a leg, sometimes 2 arms or 2 legs, but it was always only 2, and blindness. The humans and dwarves had to shoulder the burdens of those layabouts. Ochre was mined and refined down to small powder and often mixed in swills for men to drink. The first lord approached the throne. This was a man with graying but flowing locks and a simple mustache on his upper lip, which protruded mournfully out of his mouth. He puckered his lips to place further emphasis on his statement. "My lord, I bring grave news. There are rumors of soulbinders who are starting to gather in my part of the empire." "Rumors? What good are rumors? Come back to me when you have the truth. Begone from my sight, you measly ear whisperer, and count yourself lucky that I don't replace you as Lord of Kyndeeran. You are too valuable as a border castle with Voin. Please pay more attention to your domain and the defense of it than to rumors." "But, my lord, soulbinders are a serious issue in the defense of my lands. I would not have brought them to your divine attention if I didn't think these rumors were true." "Yes, and I know the seriousness of these matters. Do you think me a fool? Rumors are simply stories that old maids tell their young children at night to frighten them. I want proof! Count Hersius. Only then will I act to help you. Otherwise, take care of your own lands. Next!" This was, in fact, highly disturbing news. If soulbinders started to organize once again, it only meant that they would try to steal from the dead their leader, and that leader was Ivan Marco. This was the legendary figure who tried to transform into a perilous being outside of our dimension, and yet an observer into it also. It would not suit to only be contained in this world with all the rest of these characters. There were some who wanted the soul to roam around freely in Rupton, without the bindings of the flesh, and without moving on to the next world. For the ill-mannered, that next world will almost certainly contain an everlasting darkness and boredom. It would be a darkness where the person would be conscious, but have absolutely nothing to do for an eternity. Yes, that place was called the Nadite. And until recently, you had inhabited that place, my master. Ivan Marco was one person who certainly deserved to be put into that place. That leader had reportedly tried to swap souls between children and dogs. The children were easier to work with because they had less life experiences than an adult. And dogs were good because they were docile and followed orders. Some people claimed that this was how Sapkians were created, and a slur was made by calling one a son of Ivan Marco. Knowledge had it that this had been centuries ago, but there may have been ways to bring that soul back into its rightful form. But I doubt that could happen anytime soon. Earl Gholson had more important things to worry about. The southern borders on the mountains needed to be defended. Voin was a rather strong kingdom after all, and he didn't want them to get any idea of invading. They were much weaker in comparison to the Empire, of course, but if Voin was able to distract them, then the Iktar cities might rally together in order to retake some territory from the Empire. Now this would be devastating, too, if the two kingdoms decided to ally, and then they might be a match for the Empire, or even overtake it. There was always the pesky fact that the Iktar cities had widespread use of gunpowder weaponry, which would probably give them an upper hand. Arbalists were the main frontline troop of the Urlit Empire. They were trained beyond compare. Normally their tactics consisted of planting their Pavice shields and settling down to shoot bolts over and over into the enemy ranks. The forests in the north had led to easy access for making these fearsome weapons. There would be spearmen set out in ranks on the sides of those soldiers to rush to the defense of them if it was necessary. However, the quick flurry of bolts from the trained ranks might be fully unnecessary to send forward soldiers. That thought on his army being pushed aside, Earl Gholson was rather secure in his place in Rupton. He controlled a vast empire made up of many docile holders and castle domains, and the lords of those lands were often quite competent. Incompetency was what annoyed the Earl. He couldn't stand it among his vassals, that they did not know how to act in all situations, and that's what really bothered him about Count Hersius now. The next person in the line of applicants was a man with a white flowing beard and a bald head. He had wide brown eyes with deep crescents underneath that showed his want for sleep. This was the head of the Spellbinders Guild, a place where conjurers, thaumaturgists, and other users of the forces beyond Rupton, parentheses FBR, parentheses, as it was officially called in the Empire, gathered together to share their knowledge. Those forces were expressly strong up in the north, as they were closer to the land and listened more to the works of nature. Besides that fact, they had the most ochre mines and could afford to boast the most magic users in all of the kingdoms. This old human was Grandmaster Ellis Ukale, and he said, "My lord Earl, I come to bring you word that we have worked hard to bring out more of the forces. The Spellbinders Guild has been effective in that this has doubled the usefulness of our spells. If there is anything that must be done in the Empire, we are more than prepared to fulfill your orders. And, of course, more ochre would always help in this as well.
Fantastic news. I see that sly expression on your face, and even though you don't use the stuff yourself, I'll still requisition more for the other spellbinders. Now tell me, Grandmaster, have you heard the rumors, as Count Hersius has, that the soul-binders are returning to the southern portions of my empire?
My lord, I can tell you with all seriousness that those rumors are merely that, hearsay. You know surely that we have banned soul-bindery in all its forms for the past century. At least since I've been alive, none have you dared use it. It has become a lost art, and any knowledge we do have is safely stored in the guild library over in Utidris. I need not tell you how secure those grounds are, sire.
Right, indeed, my good Grandmaster. Battle mages watch that library round the clock. On your orders, I know. Otherwise, I have some tasks in mind to put your doubled forces to use. But I want to hear your suggestions as well.
Well, if you don't mind me being too forward, my Lord Earl, I would suggest we use this extra potency of the forces to take lands from those blighted dwarves in Voin. They and their smallets have always tried to eat away our borders for time immemorial. Plus, you'll find plenty of ochre in those mountains of theirs, and they do not have the means to even mine it yet.
It is too forward of you to say. You may be the Grandmaster of the Spellbinders, and one of my counselors, but these things should be spoken of only in those chambers. Now, begone from my sight as well. If I have more need of you, then I will request it.
The Grandmaster did bring good news, but he was out of place to suggest something so daring to the Earl in front of everyone else there. Gholson had been eyeing those mountains to the south for quite some time. There was more than just ochre there. Gold, silver, rubies, and other valuables hid in those mountains. Voin was sitting on a practical Lux printing press. It was quite lucky for the Empire that their hetman and infrastructure lacked the technological know-how to mine the more valuable commodities in any great quantity, especially the ochre. The Kingdom of Voin held the population who would be perfect at using this new technology. The Smollets were almost created for work in the mines. That's where most of the Earl's dwarves labored anyways. It was an industry which paid well in the Empire, but it was also extremely taxing. Taxing in that they paid more taxes, and they tended to break themselves on the ore they mined. The Urlit Empire's policy was to encourage mining whenever and wherever it was possible. This created a problem for the Spellbinders. As the land was destroyed by mining, so too was their magic weakened. However, now they had a literal windfall, and it would be unwise to not use this. And whatever they lost in nature could easily be gained back by ochre use, no matter how destructive it was. A new petitioner approached. This time it was a well-known one. It was a Sobkian with deep blonde fur and a kindly-looking face. He had gray, almost glazed-over eyes and floppy ears made of the softest fur you could imagine. He had a forlorn look on his face, and gripped something in those almost human paw-like hands. This was Binuchek, the leader of the United Sobkian All Might. The tribes had coalesced under his wisdom and knowledge. He knelt and held what he had up to the Earl. "My Lord Earl, I present you the tongue of our most wise woman, Sabria, as a token of our everlasting friendship. May she speak only truth in your ears, and may you gain knowledge for all the long years which you live." The tongue waggled wildly in his hands. It was incredibly long, and it seemed to contain saliva on it still. This was the once-decade gift made from the United Sobkian tribes, as they had been united since the Earl had conquered their lands and refused to put them to the sword. It was a powerful artifact which deprived the Sobkians learning whatever their wisest woman had in store for the tribes. This allowed Gholson to simultaneously rip out their future ability to make coherent plans as a tribal civilization, and it did truly speak wisdom into the ear of the owner. Binuchek wore a fine, regal robe of a pristine gray dye as he offered up this prize. It would allow him to continue being the leader of the All Might, with the backing of the Earl to strengthen his claims.
"Oh, my alt Binuchek, I've been waiting for you. You know just how much I look forward to this every decade. Have you been listening to my tongue at all?"
"Not at all, my lord. You know I am a true and faithful servant. What the Earl wills, I will. I've kept it pristine for you in the acrimonious box."
"Good, good. Once again I can trust you to deliver, alt Binuchek. Is there anything else you would have of me whilst you hold my attention?"
"Yes, I beg of you, my lord, to put a stop on the ochre production, or at least regulate it more. There are too many Sobkians dying in the streets of your own cities from overdosing. There needs to be a stop to this."
"Need. It's such a strong word, my good Binuchek. Don't these Sobkians you speak of need to get their ochre? What will happen if there's a complete halt? I will think on this subject. But otherwise it brings in too much revenue as is, and helps the spellbinders as well. Do not get your hopes up, my loyal servant."
Alt Binuchek gave the Earl such a sad, sappy, puppy-dog face as only a Sobkian could. "I beg it, my lord, but just knowing this matter is on your mind is enough for me. I will take my leave willingly. May wisdom always be whispered to you."
"It shall, with many thanks to you. Do not concern yourself overmuch. The Sobkians you speak of enjoy the ochre. Otherwise, they would not be paying so much for it. Take solace in that fact, Binuchek. Until next time."
The Earl even got up and bowed to his Sobkian servant. Alt Binuchek left the residence with a sad and heavy heart. He desperately needed something to be done about the ochre. His people were suffering. He would handle this problem in his own way. He would deal with it. After all, he was the leader of the All Might. Plus, the Sobkians were devilishly sneaky. The next petitioner stepped up to speak out to the Earl. This one was a halfling. He was rather stout of body, with a rotund belly and flowing gray mustaches. His eyes were likewise a deep brown, and he wore the standard set of clothes for a businessman. Those being decent cobbled shoes, hose, and a rather nice tunic. They weren't in any extravagant color, but merely dyed a royal blue. This was Itrius Kimin, the representative for the smallest races in the Empire. He had a rather wispy voice when he spoke. "My lord Earl, I am pleased with the utmost degree to be in your presence. As Alt Binochek said, we too have an ochre problem among the smallets now, especially among the mere. I do not request that you change any laws, but I would like to bring your attention that this problem has been spreading. What started out as a solely Sopkian problem has gone to affect us. I can see a time when it further affects the dwarves, and even one day the humans. I simply want to bring it to your further attention."
"It has been brought once, halfling. There's no need to reiterate the good Binochek's point. And whether I will bring this into my councils has now been jeopardized by your unwanted outburst. Begone from my sight, and return to your people."
The hobbit tried to bow before his Earl's Majesty, but he was succinctly ushered out by the guards. Those guards were clad in long chainmail hauberks and equipped with tunics of their ruler. They brandished halberds and butted the halfling out of the audience chamber. The Earl Gholson didn't have time for such little people's nonsense. Itrius had clearly been standing and waiting whilst Alt Binochek made his requests to the Earl. Kimin was simply wasting the time of everyone present in asking again. The rest of the petitioners went by in an almost never-ending line which took up the whole day. Earl Gholson retired to his quarters after having supped a fine dinner of chicken and Stockwinian wines. They made the best wines in their fine soil. It was a land almost built for the growing of the stuff. Maybe this was why neither Ogba nor Wolfslaw had deigned to conquer them yet. Whatever the reason, the Earl had quite drunk when he called a meeting of his counselors, and he was quite tipsy. The wine would help him get past their boringness. They were a crew from each of the various subjects which mattered in his land. Gholson was not so pleased to see that Ukael showed up. He nominally had a place there, but he had already said his piece earlier that day. Perhaps the spellbinder just wanted to reinforce the urgency of taking advantage of the forces beyond. Whatever the reason was, Gholson scowled openly at him. Beyond him sat Count Halker, the ruler of Utadritz, who we've already heard from. As it stood, this was the largest city in the Urlit Empire. It had grown to such a size because of its easy access to trade between Voin and the Iktar cities. Plus, it was on the shores of the Groshen. This meant, too, that it could send ships to Romarki even. And, as far as Ogbun. But that voyage took almost a month or so. Or longer. The Count was a fair-haired man. He wore a shortly trimmed goatee, which was a sun-bleached blonde like his hair. He had cornflake blue eyes that were sunk deep into his face from many sleepless nights going over the accounts of his city. Halkarsh only showed up to the councilors' meeting every fortnight because of the tricky travel between the many mountains and valleys needed to get to Urlitrit. Count Hersius showed his face there also. His was a very strategic city. It was located in the foothills which led to the mountains of Voin. It was mostly a castle town with fields and peasants as far as his eye could see from his lofty tower towards the north. It was to the south that everyone was worried about, Small youths of Voin were the people he was really watching from that tower. He could see the mountain vastness starting just after the fields disappeared. There was danger in those mountains. It wasn't simply Voin he was concerned about, but all the sundry creatures that found their way down to his domains. Perseus was another unwelcome sight to Gholson. He had likewise been on the council for some time as a ruler of Kyndeeran. Although his concerns for soulbinders had already been brought to the Earl's attention, the Count no doubt wanted to sink home his point at the council meeting. He should have likewise just gone home. It was a long journey through the forest, and all manner of monster might have been kept at bay with his lordly presence. Instead, his peasants would no doubt suffer at the hands of those creatures without him there. He was an idiot, but a useful one at that. Plus, his ancestral lands were perfectly situated to defend the empire from Voin if it came to war with the kingdom. Sat next to the Count was Royal Baron Urlit. He was in charge of manufacturing ochre for the crown. He primarily operated in the western mountains of Urn. This was the mountain chain which the Count Hobbler had traveled through in order to get to Urlit. The mining company of Ochre United had transformed those mountains from some place to be feared into an almost civilized landscape. A traveler could see the vast improvements in roads and a growing use of aqueducts from the mountains which were improved upon every day. The Baron wore his official colors in his tunic. They were a swarthy brown and silver with pickaxes laid in 4 squares. He was a dwarf with a rich flowing beard of black, and his hair was close cropped. His eyes were pulled apart in an almost comical fashion, and one eye was gouged out in a nasty scar from a, quote, work-related accident, unquote. His was a welcome, albeit frightful face to the Earl. This was the man who brought in the most amount of revenue out of all those sitting there. His ochre was sold far and wide, although other kingdoms had mostly banned the trade of it. In those places, it was a rich commodity to come by, and other mages often spent everything but their souls to get some. So greatly it enhanced the forces and allowed one to use magic. He was a rich man, the Baron, and he showed it in his actions. He ate and drank little, and when he did so, he took tiny bites, and only of the best of both. He had so much money that he almost rivaled Count Hobbler for the second richest man in the empire. Urlit was lucky in that he was granted the royal monopoly on ochre production. Sure, there were those tiny mines that tried to secretly mine the stuff. Those inevitably were broken up by imperial arbalists. The troops would march into those mines and shoot down anyone who resisted in a cloud of bolts. So there, the council sat around a large pine table, the 4 most important men in the realm, and their ruler, the Earl Gholson. Each sat in a high-backed chair with their names carved into it. There, the wisest course of action was to ignore the problems of the empire and enlarge its territories into Voin. End of Part 4, Chapter 4. Beginning of Part 5, Chapter 5. The Kind Kyndeeran. This was a man of only the finest quality. He wore poor woolen pants and a large baggy shirt, which his mother had so nicely made for him years and years ago. He never got rid of anything, except when it was totally used up. That shirt was almost there. It used to be dyed blue, and he had worn it on all of his adventures throughout the kingdoms of Rupton. Those were fine and fast days. He had grown tired of it all, and settled down for life now. He chose the lofty kingdom of Kyndeeran. This was a place stuck between Mert on its west, Agbun on its south and east, and then the Iktar cities and Rormarkia towards its north. Kyndeeran was a kingdom that had barely survived being squeezed into one of the other states there. Luckily, their first citizen had made precautions against that fate and had allied with Mert. Now that ruler was vying to get Wolslaw and Stokewind into its Grand Neutrality Alliance. These were all problems much above the pay grade of our fine hero today. He was a different man to the one described earlier. This one was a blacksmith in the capital city of Gholson. He had a clean-shaven face, bald head, and burnt-off eyebrows. His eyes were made of the same iron gray which he forged. He was an inconsequential man in the grand scheme of things, but to this story, he was a man who could show a lot. This was Nimun Clytrek, a blacksmith among the many who forged for the first citizen, Moltius Magnus. He had duties which involved creating horseshoes for the royal steeds, nails for the crystal-like houses of the nobles, and weapons for the waging of war. Nimun enjoyed his job tremendously. He had been apprenticed at one of the outlying villages to an old dwarven smith. In that fact, he was very lucky. There were not many dwarves left in Kyndeeran after the Great Migration. Most had fled west on their journeys to that great mountainous kingdom of Voin. Nimun had been expected to take over the village smithy after the old dwarf died, but he succinctly refused when that finally happened. The rumors about the village were that he had some wild romance going on in the capital, but that just couldn't have been the case. No, his village had been on the border with Agbun, and Nimun had seen what the slavers in Urlit had been like. Their raiding parties had been known to sometimes accidentally cross over into the northern kingdoms. Once there, these Orlovians had also, by happenstance, found people who definitely sold themselves into slavery to get out of the boredom in their own villages. Nimun was afraid that might happen to him and his friends and family, so he decided to go to the city in order to make weapons for the army. What better way to use his skills, right? The human had once thought to settle down there and court and marry some woman. He had eyed several in his teenage years, but had decided against it in the end. He had learned from experience that he couldn't trust anyone but himself, and that included any wife he would have taken. He didn't know what kinds of limits marriage would actually have placed on him outside of his romanticized ideal. There were some warning signs, too, with the women who had looked to courting. Some had threatened to throw themselves into the Heliac reefs. This would have been a fate worse than death. It was a place known to skin people alive before drowning them out of malice or sheer nature. Nimun had also heard of women pledging their loyalty to Vodaria, a goddess, only to have them completely turn around and deny it. Those same women were the ones later to be found sacrificing to Urlit for their own futures. He had known women who had pretended not to force their opinions on men, only to do it constantly, and feel embarrassed when called out for it. No. So far, Nimun would have none of that. Also, the one woman he had seriously courted wound up having no real substance to her beliefs and priorities, which were completely different from Nimun's own. That, and they also had nothing in common when you really got down to it. No, the blacksmith had avoided marriage so far. He knew this was a cruel world to be brought up into. Kyndeeran often ran short of food, and being in the city now, that was a serious problem. The villages were the first to eat because they farmed. Next came the first citizen and the nobles, then the army, and lastly the city dwellers. Nimun was a lucky one and that out of the last to be fed, he was one of the first. Working for the crown had its perks, after all. There was always the ever-present threat of war on the horizon also. Agbun was a hungry desert nation, which hoped to increase its power into the force of Kyndeeran. That was one thing it was known for, at least. There were large quantities of forest land throughout the small kingdom. Besides that, nothing really truly remarkable escaped from it, except for stories of the ancients and their ruins. One thing that Namun truly missed from the village was that there were always children running about. He had an incredibly soft heart for children. Namun thought of them as like pets. They had no agency to themselves, and they could not be held responsible for their actions. At least that's what he thought, since he had only had second-hand experience with them. The humans saw the kids running around and having fun with their parents and friends. He wanted that for himself, since there was no fun in his own life. Again, there were no women in the village who actively wanted children as of yet, and in the city they just wanted to sacrifice to Urlit for their own personal advancements. Namun's heart ached for the warm embrace of a family, and a way to see his own blood attain something which he had so thoroughly sought for: success and adventure. There were many adventurers in Gholson in those days, all gathered together at the Flying Floozy, a tavern of vast proportions that housed a good deal of the travelers passing through the city. Namun would stop in on the rare occasion when he had a day off. Now, there were not many of those, as a vast quantity of pike orders were moving through the smithy. For what, he would only guess. The adventurers and booze at the tavern at least took his mind off of the problems of his day. It was one such day where we find our Namun in the Floozy. It was getting on being evening out, and almost completely dark at that. The city was made up of a heap of buildings, all piled one on top of the other, in a very haphazard sort of way. All the buildings were technically separate, but there was always a route to sneak through them all unnoticed. That was until you got to the double walls of the castle, which blocked everyone else off. That castle was a rotund round thing with short squat stone spires which didn't reach very high, and shouldn't have been referred to as spires to begin with. Still, some residents like to think of them as such. As stated, the Flying Floozy had an enormous pot-bellied interior of fine carved wooden decorations on its walls, which were painted over with much more lewd scenes to match its name. The tables and chairs were all of the simplest quality, that the chairs were really nothing more than 4 pieces of wood strapped to another piece for sitting. It was quite a wonder that everyone who was anyone wound up there. There were also plenty of rooms for a couple hours' rent deep inside the heart of this bulbous beast. Seriously, the owners were so stingy not to upgrade any of the seating and rooms that they had to have been elves, but no one had actually seen the owners ever. Instead, what they saw was a skinny, jaundiced, kindly-looking fellow with buck teeth and brown eyes, who manned the bars. This man claimed that he know nothing 'bout nothing. He never put a look in to even talk about anything besides what you'll be having. His breath always stank too, not with ale or beer, but something more reptilian in nature. Besides that creature, there were of course the mandatory bar wenches with their rotund everything, taking orders from everyone. This must have been the real unspoken reason why people showed up there so often. Although the real reason must have been just to hear the tales of adventurers. That was definitely the real reason why Namun was there on that evening. The place was crowded, with a long wooden table running down the center along with all the rest squashed together, in good measure like Gholson itself. Beer and ale were the primary staples there to go along with a really good barley soup. Again, this was strange in the fact that the growing season for barley had been long past, But that's besides the point. What really mattered was that it was delicious. There was a huge hanging iron chandelier thrown up in the middle of this room, and iron braziers stuck into the walls to provide what little light they could. Those flames always struggled to fight against the constant spittle and chew juice that thrived in that tavern. It was on this long table that Namun sat with a hearty glass of dark brown beer, which tasted something akin to melted cheese and pork combined together. It was a distinctly strange and absolutely wonderful taste that still resonates in his memory to this day. Whenever Namun got a chance to tell this tale, he always made sure to specifically include how good that beer was. The blacksmith liked beers, and so he partook in one after the other as more people sided by his side. There were some wild and wonky characters around Namun on that particular evening. Halflings, dwarves, and humans he saw all around, and out of the corner of his eye he could have sworn on his dead old granny Magdara that he saw some lizardmen and Sobkians even. Everyone was drinking, and it was a wild and raucous night. The noise was almost so much that they had to call in the city guards just to get orders through. Luckily, everyone shouted over everyone else and got their points across indubitably so. Namun was straining to hear the tale of one adventurer in particular. This one was a dwarf strapped to his gills with sheaths and scabbards for knives and swords. It was an insane thought to carry all of those things into battle, but the dwarf made that thought much more practical, and likely with every word he said. "By the gods, I did stab me sword right there, through the belly of that monster. It hid me by me hinds when I got the jump over it. It weren't expecting that'n for sure. Still, I felt sorry afterwards, on account of it only being a wee bit of child." The whole room seemed to erupt in laughter at the ending to his tale. Namun was sorely disappointed in that he had missed most of it through all the noise. He especially hated that he didn't know why that dwarf was wearing such a ludicrous amount of weaponry still. Namun simply took another swig of his delicious brew, and continued to carry on and looked for another adventure to focus his ears on. That was a human adventure, about the same height as Namun himself. He had simple brown eyes and rough half-beard of black. He wore a hardy leather jerkin, and he itched at a strap which was designed to carry a poleaxe, but the instrument of war was conspicuously missing. He sounded like one of those dirty Ogbonites from the south, and he was dark enough to be one. Still, he had what sounded like an interesting story to tell. "It's been weeks and weeks that we started searching through the forest for some sign that we were on its trail. The forests of Kyndeeran, you see, are rumored to hold the secrets for the long-lost Anrathian Empire. That race of gnomes who are rumored to have possessed the powers of curving roots to their whims and making vast underground civilizations. I mean, you guys already know this. Come on. We were hunting for those creatures for nigh on a month now, when all of a sudden, right there in the forest, our resident spellbinder says, 'Well, why in Omelis's terrible name are we even doing this?' I miss the featherbeds of Olaf. And by Vodaria, he was right. We were all feeling it was pointless after being out for so long. And so I said to him, 'Let's think about it over a nice beer at the Floating Floozy in Gholson.' Everyone around me cheered, and here we are 2 months in. 1 month spent searching, and 1 month spent here." Oh, ha, ha, ha. The area around him and himself erupted in laughter. They all raised their glasses to this fine turn of events. Maybe this would reflect well on Kyndeeran's to the Ogbonites when they went back home. Maybe it would relieve some of the tensions that had been felt so recently. Ogden was large, and there were untold treasures in the forests of Kyndeeran. The sap and amber trades had already worked out well for the kingdom. Hopefully they could stave off war for some time yet, but that was up to the first citizen. Namun just had to forge what he was told to, and take his breaks when he had them. He was thoroughly enjoying his time listening to the various adventurers. There were so many in the tavern too. It was really something else for him. It seemed even more full than it usually was, and usually it was nearly filled to the brim. Namun tried to put away a sizable portion of his allowance each month, but every time he just happened to show up at the Floating Floozy and lose it all on booze. That was all right, though. He was a simple man. All Namun needed was a roof over his head and a belly full. Sure, he often wished for a family and children, but he was good where he was for now. He took a larger swig and almost choked on it. Namun sputtered and drank some more. The best thing to stop choking is to throw more stuff down one's throat, as we all know. A gruff dwarf sitting nearby noticed his struggles and tried to jump up and whack him on the back, to no avail. Soon, the blacksmith had dark beer splattering all over his face and down his clothes. Namun gasped and barked for air as he fell over the table in front of the other adventurers. He writhed for a bit, but in the end, that was his death. End of Chapter 5, Story 5. The Kind Kyndeeran. Chapter 6, Story 6. The Bound Hobbler. His father was a real piece of work. He was probably made that way after marrying his mother. Although working as a mercenary in the free companies of the Iktar cities could do that to you to begin with. He was a cruel man, only made crueler by his wench of a wife. They had met in some bar, tavern, or brothel, and quickly set about the work of prolonging their unnatural species, for he was an orc, and she a mere human. This was in itself a disgusting match. But when they could no longer easily satisfy their wants through bloodletting, the father left, and his mother sold him into slavery. Slavery was common practice in most of the Iktar cities, except for Pasnui, where it was extremely forbidden. And they constantly tried to free the slaves, much to the chagrin of the slave traders. This was Nigork. He was bred out of the hatred which two people had for each other, and sold to further their love of life. It was only by the good graces of Quania, goddess of fertility, that he had survived his mother's original want for sacrificing him to Urlit. Those graces, plus his father's spite for her, that spite had made Nigork stronger up until the time that his mother sold him into slavery. She was a real wench. She could pool like the best of them, and carry drinks just the same, and she wanted a life unimpeded by a half-orc son who would get in her way to do these things. And so, who was Nigork sold to? An elf. And he sold him to the Glorious Gladiatorial Company, of course! This young man would grow into a tough fighter one day, thanks to his lineage. Nigork would start fighting and training while he was still a boy, just 5 years old to start. His complexion was a dark green color, like most orcs, though he lacked the traditional tusks which those creatures were so wont to grow out. He had much higher intelligence than was normal for an orc, on account of his human mother, and so this helped him in the arena. The first person he met there was the fighter de jour, who simultaneously set up the fights and trained the fighters. This man was a large, muscled human with dark eyes to go with his dark face and shortly cropped hair. He was clean-shaven in order to suit maximum mobility in the arena. He wore a simple tan tunic and leather cobbled boots. There was a short sword on his side, wrapped in an ornate leather belt, with 2 running lines down it. That was the only thing which denoted his rank, besides a headband dyed in purple. The cold, hard eyes of a seasoned veteran stared out at Nigork. The fighter du jour was called only by his title, for a slave of his rank has no name, and no purpose besides bringing pleasure to his master. The fighter walked slowly around Nigork, examining him from every angle with a lolling pace, before he said, "Aye, you'll make one fine piece of specimen for the arena. Good thing they brought you here to me before they threw you amongst the other lot to which we lead. Yours and mine are to be fighters, to entertain our betters. This is what we were born to do. The flows have brought us here in just the right time, and the right place to serve our purposes, and to bow out into each other at the end of our allotted times. You and I will become the same in the end. Our souls will mix, their souls will mix, and we'll all be one. Do not worry about those you kill, for the flows have deemed that it was their time to be taken into its embrace. Do not worry about dying. The flows have deemed it is your time to go with everyone else. Do not worry, and only focus on continuing to entertain here on Rupton. Continue your flow here as nothing matters. You die, I die, do not mind. This is how you will win, Nigork. This is how you will triumph for yourself. You are not a slave, but a refugee on the flows, and they will take you where they will." What was Nigork to make of this? A burly, almost huge human fighter du jour, revealing his secrets to this 5-year-old. It was indeed strange, but it would turn out for the best in the coming years. "I have special plans for you, Nigork. I see your potential. You are one of a kind, and today you will train with me. I will outfit you with the knowledge of the flows and how to utilize them. You will replace me one day. Here, take this club. Your training starts now." And so it did. Nigork trained every day, except for Kwania's day. This was the only way in which he knew that time was passing in those years. Nigork's bones ached from swinging his club to and fro for hours and hours on end, day in and day out. There were no breaks. He was fed hardtack and given drink while he fought, and had to soil his garments while fighting. His clothes became sordid rags, and were hardly replaced, so that Nigork had to, at times, fight naked. They fought in a tinier circle outside through everything that the elements wanted to throw at them. There were times when it snowed up to their knees, and yet he kept fighting while releasing his body to the flows. Nigork knew that he needed this in order to survive. He knew that the flows would take him where he needed. The training like that continued up until Nigork was 15, and at that time his life really began. He started to fight in the arena. The fighter du jour walked up to him while he was sleeping in the allotted 4-hour window for that activity. He started speaking quickly to the awoken young half-orc. "Today we start you in the arena. There will be one opponent, a dwarf of what should be equal strength to you. The weapons will be knives. You trained with clubs, and so this should feel like air in your hands." Aye, I look forward to gutting him, fighter. When does it start? Now, grab your gear and go to the arena. The arena master will hand you the weapon. Continue onwards with the flow. Nigork went to his locker to find new equipment in there. A richly colored green cuirass of light leather and bolted strings fitted comfortably on him. It was the first time in 10 years that he had received something so nice. There was a subtle leather helmet with an open face to match the raiment. Nigork donned these along with a newly cobbled pair of leather sandals. It was a fine sight of all leather by the end of his dressing, and that smell was fantastic. Nigork walked confidently past the others in his pursuit of glory in the arena, past the training circle of his whole life, which had ingrained these automatic reflexes into him. He approached the arena gates to the arena master, who greeted him with grim determination set in his face.
Here's your blade. You'll want to put it on a show for the audience. Try not to get killed too soon, and don't kill him too soon either. When you do go for the kill, make it memorable. Gut him good, or bleed him out. Make it memorable, and you will be remembered. What'll happen'll happen. Let me at him, and there ain't nothing to be done about it. I've been restraining me for years, and now my time's come. Let me at him.
This was a strange voice for Nigork, one of the highlands of the north. It was not heard from his mouth before this moment, for there was no easy prey within his reach. Now, something was revealing itself inside of the half-orc. Something which needed blood to satiate it. Something that needed to take vengeance on all those who had harmed him. The knife in his hand was changing him. It was a strange knife. Green around the edges, and oh, so very thin. It was as sharp as it could get, and with a handle of wood covered in some sort of supple leather which was too tanned to be leather. Oh no, it was a very strange weapon. On you go, you crazy orc! Nigork walked up the slight ramp to the arena. This arena was on the outskirts of Atar, in the Atar cities. It was a very dry and hot place with little to no trees around, although there was a large forest to the west, but for the most part it was comprised of steplands like much of the cities were. Atar was positioned rather strategically on the borders of Rormarkia, Mert, and Kyndeeran, all within easy reach. Slavery was technically forbidden in Rormarkia, but if someone wished to sell themselves into servitude for their masters to treat them as they wanted, then, by the laws of their god Rormark, it was all right. After all, a fair deal is a fair deal. Mert and Kyndeeran, on the other hand, did not look so kindly upon the practice. There were no official laws in their lands, but there was an unwritten code not to do it. If anyone was found with the slave, then they were immediately ostracized by the community at large. Those two kingdoms kept the practice down in this manner of doing things without taking a side. Many travelers came often to the arena there in Atar. They were made up of a wide variety of folk, although Smallets were overwhelmingly in that crowd. Those races tended to have more bloodlust to them, probably, or they simply didn't compete in the slave fights in their own kingdoms, and so they wanted to see something unusual. Smallets and an overwhelming number of elves were there. Elves made up the primary buyers and sellers of slaves throughout the kingdoms of Rupton. If there was money to be made, then you would find elves there to make it. Nigork didn't know it, but he had in fact been bought by a tall elf whose main feature which stood out most were his strangely purple eyes. Those eyes pierced into any who met his gaze. Some had said that he had come from far-off land, somewhere beyond the Rormarkian Sea. But there was no one who could imagine that possibly being true. There were several islands and isles in the sea which had been spotted by the Romarkians, but even those had been too far off for them to colonize. Still, tales were told of how Rormark himself had crossed that body of water hundreds, if not thousands, of years ago. That same elf had sold Nigork to the glorious gladiatorial company for quite a large profit, and had returned to wherever he had come from. The half-orc had only known of his life in the company, his life as a slave. Denizens of the Iktar cities were of dark complexion, from so much sun in the steppelands, or even the deserts of Agbun to the south, had primarily been the people to do the dirty work with slaves. They were so plentiful that they normally fell into all sorts of jobs, be it adventuring for lost ruins or the simple life of a slave serf. The Iktar cities attracted all manner of fighting men to wage the almost never-ending petty wars which the city fought with each other, and so this sometimes called for slave battalions. The arena itself seemed almost too massive to be true, as Nigork saw when he walked through 2 iron gates up that ramp. There were several houses inside of it, only with no one in them, along with obstructions made out of clay bricks to form different maze-like walls. Weapons of all manner lay inside of those houses, guarded by large yiziks, beasts with great wide jaws, although vertically narrow, and misshapen lopsided eyes that pointed forward to a short snout. They were about the size of a large hound dog. All of this was unbeknownst to Nigork. He only heard a strange racking cough which rang out from the houses. The half-orc was awestruck by the extremity of this arena. The marble seats were laid out in 4 rows up to the height of several stories on only 2 sides of the arena. There was a great clamor being made by the crowd as he moved on out into the blaring sunlight of the steppelands. Lots of clapping and shouting greeted his gaze as it moved around the seating of the stadium. Nigork did not know what to fully expect inside of this place. He had not been told anything about the arena, and had not even been allowed to see it. This was a true failure on the part of the fighter de jour. Or maybe it had been on purpose. The duel to come would most certainly be made more interesting by his lack of knowledge, and his trust in the flow should be able to guide him towards victory. Nigork broke off his odd reverie in order to see his opponent across the arena. It was hard through all of the obstacles, and he didn't actually manage to do it. There was no dwarf there. That didn't matter, as the arena master broke into the various noises of the crowd.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a true fight on our hands today. 2 beginners facing off with knives to start. A dwarf and a half-orc. Who will win? Who will die? Let the bloodletting begin!
A great horn struck out through the arena to shake the ground and rile the yiziks further. The crowd started shouting applause. They were too intoxicated with the gore to come from this fight, even with just 2 people, as it was still a glorious day in the arena. The first fight always set the standards for how the rest of these gladiators' careers would go. Nigork was confident as all get out, while he continued to revel in this spectacle. He almost forgot that he was the show itself. Then the half-orc advanced forward towards where his opponent should be, although that dwarf was nowhere to be seen still. He was probably hiding like all those dirty smallets were wont to do. Those creatures always chose the treacherous route like the god of skullduggery wanted, Agilridge. Their short stature made it extremely easy to be pawns of that god. This dwarf was probably one who followed Nimorg instead, though. He was short, very tiny for a dwarf, and extremely strange for his muscular size. He had shoes on his hands and held the knife between his toes. He had seemingly disappeared from the arena. That was until he plopped out of one side of the house. He screamed incessantly as a Yizig chased his tail before he turned to confront its gaping maw. Shoes on hands is strange, you say? This dwarf had a forewarning, you see. He punched one side of that grotesque creature in the face with one shoe and shoved the other into its mouth. Then he flipped over himself and somersaulted the knife straight down onto its head. The crowd stood silent in the face of this incredible athleticism. The spectators erupted in cheers as that dwarf returned from the tiny house with a large, overweight poleaxe. Now he came into Nigork's sight. The dwarf was likewise wearing a leather raiment, only it was dyed a deep brown to go along with his beard. He wore no hat, though. Instead, the fighter decided to show off his flowing short hair. There was a moment in time where the two of them made eye contact from across the battlefield before moving swiftly towards each other. Nigork didn't know where that huge weapon had come from, and he didn't care. This would just make it all the more interesting. The half-orc rushed unabashedly onward to face what would probably be his own doom. He had no experience in knife fighting, but really, how different could it be from wielding a club? The instincts of all those years would still be able to kick in and come to his defense. Nigork wasn't worried. The flows would take him where they needed to take him. Of that, he was certain. The two marched onwards in meeting fate. Nigork ignored the noises of Yizigs and steeled himself for the fight ahead. Whatever happened, he would be all right. The two came abreast in the middle of that place, with the crowd now calling out their favorites on either sides of them. They stared down each other one more time before engaging. In that time, Nigork had one moment to reassure himself once again. Nothing mattered, so long as the masters were happy, so long as the people were. The dwarf squared himself solidly against Nigork. He thrust out the spear-like head of his weapon in order to cut straight in. That's when Nigork rolled under it to close the gap. The dwarf didn't have much time to react, and it looked as if he was taken completely off guard. That was until Nigork hesitated for a mere millisecond to strike into the chin of his adversary. His opponent was able to see it coming, and knocked his own head back in laughter. The laughter only acted as a further distraction to the half-orc. Nigork was thrown back in force from whatever magic this was. He fell flat onto his back, staring up in horror at the tiny muscular fellow who lifted his weapon with the spike pointed straight at him. All it would take was one loosening of the dwarf's little finger, and gravity would take the means into its own hands and kill him. But the crowd doesn't like such kills. It likes one that has a lot of blood and gore involved to make the kill a real spectacle. That is exactly what stayed the dwarf's hand on holding back the reins of death. He picked the poleaxe back up and stepped in such a way that it would be easier to cut up Nigork for the crowd. Nigork's opponent spoke some words deep from his soul and whispered them to his poleaxe. Immediately, the blade caught on fire. The dwarf hefted his weapon for one clean sweep down the side of Nigork. End of Chapter 6, Story 6. The Bound Hobbler. Start of Chapter 7, Story 7. The Grain Clock. It was thrumming. It always thrummed like this. A thumping began to go along with it. It wasn't the sound, just an overall feeling in his head. Ever present, it needed to go away. The sand glowed orange all around, just like his beard, but the sky was an absolutely beautiful blue, just like his eyes. That sand swirled and crept throughout his entire body at this point. Why the hell was he in this desert? Or whatever this place was. Maybe it actually was hell. Dalgot closed his eyes tight to get away from this interminable pain. The great desert was glowing and blowing all around him now. A sandstorm had started, and he needed to find shelter. That, and his stomach hurt painfully, as it clenched every time he made a move to get up. And get up he had to. It wouldn't be long before the animals came for him. Or the slavers. They were always prowling along, trying to pick up anyone who was so unfortunate as to be caught alone in the desert. It happened more times than not, with all the caravaneers trying to deliver their goods and make a little bit of profit. All they wanted was to make a decent living in this world. But he supposed that's exactly what the slavers were trying to do as well. Time and experience had taught Dalgot a few things from all sides, something which he hoped was an expert at now. This way he could justify anything. One thing that the politics of Ogbun had taught him is that all cultures are beautiful, and therefore, by justifying any atrocity committed by a culture, they were all equal. At least that's what everyone had taught him. It was vastly different once you got into the real world, and had to concern yourself over eking out a living by whatever means necessary. That used to be the calling cards in the cities of Ogbun. Now look where it got him. A fistful of looks to buy his last meal with, but Dalgot had yet to enjoy it. Instead, it was just a mouthful of sand. He threw his hand against his belly to create a satisfying, reverberating sound. Maybe that would stave off his starvation for now. Dalgot finally raised himself onto all fours. His hands and knees were starting to get buried in the sand from his exertions. It burnt sublimely. There was no escaping this heat. It was everywhere, all-encompassing. He really wished that there was some hair left on his head. But alas, it had all migrated to his beard. Why didn't he shave that blasted thing before joining up for the journey? It looked too good, that's why. A solid reason for sure. Plus, he stood out amongst all the caravaneers, for they were already shaven. That's what he liked to do, to stand out. But apparently it didn't work in his favor this time. As he was on all fours, he looked around. Destruction. Carnage. Those that weren't beaten into submission and captured were killed. There was no real escape. Either become a slave or die. Those were the options in this great orange desert. And why did they think they were any different? The caravaneers thought they could pack enough, hire enough guards, and travel through this god-forsaken place to find a fortune on the other end. They had heard stories of the massive cities on that side. Maybe that's where all the slaves were sold. Or maybe that's where they could finally get some peace and retire. That's what they were hoping for, at least. Anything to eke out a living in this futile existence that now faced the kingdoms, and humans especially. Humanity was a cockroach, though. It always hung on. Dalgot tried to raise himself to his full height to finally stand up. He couldn't do it. At every inch that he spread out his legs to carry him, they screamed in pain. Assuredly, he'd just need time to recuperate, to relax, and everything would be all right. His legs would heal in time. Time. A great man once told him that he could always regain ground, but never time. Dalgot was sure that this man had heard it from another source. He was always so blightedly skeptical of everything. That skepticism didn't mean anything now. He was like a baby once again. Through this coarse sand, he crawled all over the nearest place, towards the nearest body. Maybe someone else had survived. Maybe. It was a woman, in her mid-30s maybe. He remembered her how she was in life. Dark brown curls that had run in ringlets down to her shoulders. Dalgot had been surprised that she had joined up, knowing the dangers to be faced. Her heady laugh seemed to bring joy to the entire company. Now, in death, that laugh would ring no more. Her face was covered in blood, smashed in by a baton. I guess she struggled too much, fought against the slavers, to the very end like some of the others had done, like Dalgot had done. But why had he been spared? No matter. He searched through her pockets while avoiding that bloodied stare. Just some pieces of luck. Not even one whole one for all this trouble. Dalgot kept searching. Still nothing. He fell onto his back next to the dead woman. He was exhausted just from this simple action. The thought that he was looting his former friends never sprang up. This is what they did to survive. Principles were for the wealthy. For the people whose stomachs who were full. Dalgot didn't have those excuses anymore. He closed his red eyes as the sun kept threatening to break down his retina. It wanted to do so badly. Can we ascribe personality to this glowing red thing in the sky? Why not? It was probably a person who invented it and loved to torture those on Rupton, unlucky enough to be under its gaze. It beat down on him like his nearest friendly loan shark after a long night of bad gambling. Dalgot closed his mouth fully to keep in any of the moisture that was left. How long had he been unconscious? That time slipped by with no second thoughts. He blinked again to see the sun moving forward, and he saw his sun moving along with it. That sun that he had never had. The one he always dreamed of raising, and to think he would never have that opportunity now. Or maybe he would. Maybe he could escape with his life. How far had they even made it? 100? 200 miles? Dalgot wasn't sure. He always blinked out when traveling. It was an excuse to get time to move faster. He kept his blinders on and just focused on walking. This was probably why they had been taken so totally by surprise. The few homemade muskets that they had were no use in the overwhelming force which attacked them. Those slaver scum. Sure, there were some slaves owned by the caravan master, but he was no property. Dalgot was a free man, and curses be on those who tried to make it otherwise. He groaned as he moved onto his side to find some comfort. That didn't work. There must have been something broken in him. Lots of things broken in him. What land had he come from? It didn't even matter now. What mattered was that he got up. Dalgot opened his eyes and managed to get onto all fours once again. Once more, that stove known as sand burned his hands. Still, he crawled forward to the next dead caravaner. This time, it was a man he came across. His saber was still caught in its sheath. No time to even defend himself. Dalgot checked himself to see that his own sword was gone. Curses. It had been a nice one. He had spent half a year's salary on it. Solid iron it was. Even the handguard was beautifully shorn into it. Let's see what this man's sword was like. A decent saber, though made of bronze, a soft metal, and low quality from what he could see. Dalgot tried to avoid the dead man's face this time, though he could still see it. The eyes were gouged out in utter hatred. His face was unrecognizable, but he remembered a stern man with shaven cheeks who carried a saber like this one. That man had stood strong, swinging as often as he could. Maybe that's why the slavers had treated him like this, in such a brutal manner. Dalgot wanted to turn aside and spit, But there was nothing in his mouth to help with that. Sand was everywhere about him. That storm had been no joke, but he pressed onward to loot the rest of his fellow former comrades. That reminds me, he thought. I have to join the Oregon Gunners if I make it back in one piece. That might be the worst job, but it would beat this by any measure. At least that thrumming in his head had stopped. It was just the hunger in his belly that he had to contend with now. To get some millet in that stomach of his, then he'd really be in for a treat. Make it with fresh milk and heat it just how Doggoat liked it. But would he ever see a single drop of milk or a kernel of grain again? I doubt it, but we'll see. Doggoat quickly unbelted the dead man and secured the sword around his own hip. It was especially difficult being on all fours still, but he needed to work on that strength, to get it up to appropriate levels once more. He reached into the coat pockets of this man, through the blood-drenched gray wool which had now been turned crimson. It was a classic jacket, in total 4 pockets on the front, with a nice light collar shaped perfectly to pop up, and 2 places where some shiny striped epaulets were hanging. Already dark with age, and countless pools of blood hanging on to make it difficult to tell what rank this man had been before his demise. Doggoat searched through the lower 2 larger pockets to find anything of value. There was a lot of stuff in there, but it was all just papers. He could hardly read any of it, as he had trained in more practical things instead of learning to fully grasp the written language. There was an interesting drawn picture of Starfton. That one he pocketed in his own pants for later, knowing that it might bring him luck. Otherwise, not even a single luck on the man. Probably those slavers already took all the money off of these caravaneers. Probably. Wasn't certainly, though. Doggoat tried his legs again. They still weren't having it. He had tried to raise himself from a kneeling position this time. Even that kneel was almost too much for him. Doggoat crawled on to the next slain caravaneer. At least that's what he thought. A soft groan escaped the wounded man as he began to encroach on the wounded caravaneer. Doggoat crawled closer to get a better listen and look. This one had been beaten worse than Doggoat. His arms were hanging loose at his sides, clearly broken out of their sockets and bent to an unfortunate angle. This man had bright blonde hair on his head and was trying to sport a thin, transparent mustache. He failed at it, as he did with everything else in his life. None of the caravaneers had gotten to know each other well. They were all too suspicious even to introduce themselves. It was only the caravaneer master who knew their names, and that master wasn't in the sport of giving out information either. Maybe that's why the band had been killed and enslaved so easily. Maybe. Doggoat approached, wheezing at every crawl, but he made it. It was difficult, but he was getting better at navigating this sand, at gaining traction with all his limbs. It still burnt his hands. He was desperately hoping that someone had worn the traditional leather gloves as the officers did. That old man had none. The groaning continued to raise in volume as he got closer. Psst. Hey, shut up with that noise. Doggoat whispered this urgently as he neared the downed man. The groaning continued and Carter threw some sand at the man to get him to be quiet. There could still be more slavers. He hissed to keep this person from drawing any unnecessary attention. The sand merely blew back into his own face. Doggoat struggled and cursed his misfortune. He tried to fully open his eyes and remove the sand from them, but to no avail. Doggoat roiled in pain. Maybe one of these people had some sort of eye protection. Maybe. After several minutes of struggle, He finally was able to excavate all the sand from his eyes. At least the sun wasn't so unbearable anymore. It started to sink lower into that cloudless blue sky, though it still had not fully converted over to dusk yet. Oh, how he wished it had. At least then there wouldn't be so much trouble with this incredible sunburn he was getting. The man was still groaning. It ground on Dalgot's nerves now. All this noise might bring about another bout of slavers. That's exactly what they didn't need. Finally, he managed to crawl over to the caravaneer. Dalgot grabbed the man by the collar and pulled him roughly. "Shut up, brother! You're going to bring them all back to us. That'll be the end of us!" The wounded man groaned once more in his arms. Dalgot landed his hand squarely on the man's mouth to silence him. The screams had begun, and those were now muffled. "Shut up, man! I'm not trying to kill you, but I will if you don't keep quiet." That seemed to do it for the wounded man. He finally quit his screaming and moaning. "There, that's better," Dalgot said as he gave him another once over. He found that the man's legs were in one piece at least. Hopefully those worked. Broken arms were wearing a lancer's uniform. Whoever he was in the past must have been someone who was well respected. There was a leather holster hanging by his side. No doubt it used to contain some rudimentary form of black powder pistol. The best form of defense out there, but also one of the rarest. Of course it was empty now. Probably the powder and balls had all been taken too. Dalgot riled through the man's pockets also. The old guy had a startled look to him now. Don't worry, I have to fix something up with you. Gotta make you better." Dalgot was just looking for valuables again, but to no luck. These slavers were pretty good. It seemed so far that they had gone through each of the down men's pockets and looted them all. The groaning man had so far been quiet, but now he acted up again. "Can you do anything besides make noise?" Dalgot was getting annoyed with this guy. He hoped there weren't any wild animals about. The man tried to say something, but all he could manage out was an utterly terrible wheeze that came slowly. It seemed this was his dying breath as he shut up with his groaning now. Dalgot moved on. It wasn't his first time seeing death, and it definitely wouldn't be his last. He still had to witness his own. That stomach which had been grumbling with hunger was once again hurting him. He needed to get food. Dalgot moved on to the next corpse, several feet beyond the fresh one. It was another man whose hair had been freshly oiled that morning. He must have been wealthy to afford such luxury. What was he doing on this expedition, then? Dalgot crawled over once again. Upon closer inspection, he could see that the man even had tanned leather boots. Those weren't seen very often where he came from. Dalgot tore off his own bark moccasins that were already falling apart anyways. He started tugging the boots off of the dead man's feet. It was harder than he thought. Maybe he had been dead for quite some time already. Dalgot pulled and pulled, but to no success. He thought about severing the man's legs with his newfound saber, but that wouldn't give him any greater leverage to get the boots off. Dalgot decided against the idea and began ruffling through the dead man's pockets. Of course, no money. He found several papers at least. He took those out, a couple with letters all written over them. He threw those to the wind. There was one gem amongst them, however, a map. At least Dalgot could read maps. Oh, lucky day, my lucky day, how sweet the sound of freedom. There was a clearly marked outpost on it. What else was there to see? They had mapped until the Rormarkian Sea with all the cities and towns in between. He hadn't heard of most of them. Whoever had this guy been? Some geographer explorer of some sort? Maybe that's why he was hired for this ill-fated caravan. Maybe. Alright. Dalgot had come from Ogban. Now, how far were they actually from there? He thought, and he thought. His memory was always full of so many holes. Some sort of disease no doubt caused it. Maybe 100 miles, maybe 200. The best thing to do is to go for the middle. Let's say 187. This desert was big. Too big for his liking. At least he knew they were going west, towards the sea, trying to make contact with the traders there. A city grew forth on the map. Not so much a city by his reckoning, but more of a village nearby to where he thought he was. Maybe some 20 miles to go, and Dalgot would run into it. First things first, he had to find food, and he had to find water. Dalgot went back to pulling off the man's boots. Oh, how he wanted them. Those would come in handy in this sand. No more burning his feet with every step and living off of the blisters that grew because of the bark. He'd be like a magistrate. Such nice boots he would have. After reading the map, his strength now ebbed into his arms. They were as if he had a hearty meal before training. The thoughts in his head nourished him as well. Dalgot would have those blasted boots. He tugged desperately at them, and decided to throw some sand into them to try to dislodge those tough feet. It was successful, and finally he was able to get those boots off. Dalgot poured out the sand, shook them to get it all out. He didn't care that it had come from that recently killed cartographer, explorer, or whatever it had been. It didn't matter now. All that mattered was that he was alive, and he'd just got some pretty sweet shoes. They fit nicely, too. Dalgot wriggled his feet around from his lying position. There was at least another corpse he hadn't rifled through yet. Dalgot crawled towards it. Another man, scabbard empty, and it looked as if he had a nicely sized ammunition pouch for musket balls. But there was no holster like the other man had. He must have been one proficient in the use of flintlocks then. Probably a sharpshooter. There were no more balls in the pouch, but rifling through the dead man's pockets, he did discover some unused black powder for use. The standard for anyone able to afford such an awesome weapon. Curses again. How Dalgot had wished he had one during the attack. It had all happened so suddenly without him even realizing it. They attacked with maces and clubs to knock everyone out, trying to take the most people as possible to be sold at market. Lucky or not, Dalgot had been thought to be dead. Maybe he would be able to take advantage of this strike of good fortune. Just maybe. Dalgot searched through all of his pockets. He didn't bother looking at the dead man's face this time. Those grizzled eyes wouldn't haunt him, but still, it was always an unpleasant sight. He discovered an almost hidden pocket inside of this man's jacket. Fantastic! It was full of millet kernels. I guess this corpse had once fancied to snack on the stuff that was often nicknamed wealth. He swallowed it all. How tasteless it was, and how dry. Dalgot didn't care. It was food, and that's what's mattered. But it was so little. But it was food. His mouth generated much-needed saliva to better take it down. Dalgot's stomach still ached tremendously. He needed some real food. Dalgot noticed some words on the back of the map. Blasted. More words that were useless to him. He couldn't read, but we can. Leaves of green. Turned brown. All is death. The End to the Kingdom Swell by J.S. Gholson. About the author. J.S. Gholson's favorite thing is to write and spend time with his new wife Yulia. Mr. Gholson is now reunited with her in Russia. He's a ravenous history lover, and the two together are avid travelers, flying all over the world whenever they get the chance. Mr. Gholson was recently diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and tries to make the best of life while he has it. When writing this, he is only 22 and is looking forward to the next book in the Congress of the Dwarf series. If you want to contact him with questions, comments, or praise, he looks forward to it. His email is jgholson, jgholson at masonlive.gmu.edu. Again, that is jgholson at masonlive.gmu.edu. And thank you for listening to my audiobook. If you want to pick up a copy, you can find a link in the description. And I hope you enjoyed it. And I look forward to the next ones also. And I hope you look forward to those also too. Have a good one.